it brings together different perspectives, different views of the world to kind of try and, I suppose, find a home where we can kind of, within Ireland anyway, share our experience on how are we grappling with some of those things? How can we actually improve our work by getting to know people? Contacts, networking, and so on. All those are very important. Almost the soft things about development. We don't talk about them. We don't write them down. But actually, knowing the right people makes a huge difference. You might have a good idea, but who you bring it to? I think by coming here, you get to kind of, if you're open to meeting new people, this is a fantastic forum for generating new ideas.
For us, and I do really appreciate that this conference has brought in the critical questions and brought the politics back in a real sense, and we just really need to continue that. Because we are at a moment where we have a war on terror, where we have a massive migration problem, and we have Ireland beginning to make choices that a lot of us cannot possibly be happy about, including our Minister of Trade and our Minister of Aid, etc. So
it's all about organising spaces where conversations can be enabled, knowledge can be shared, opinions can be aired, comment can be sought.
I kind of want to motivate why we need an evidence base, and I also want to talk about, what kinds of evidence are good evidence in my view, and then a little bit on how we should use that evidence for policy making. What evidence? There's a lot of evidence out there. There's a lot of bad evidence out there. There's a lot of badly conducted research out there. So it's important for us to be able to distinguish what evidence is the evidence that we should be using to inform policy and aid programs and the design of aid programs. And in my view, kind of my ideal approach to addressing to testing impact, to testing whether programs work, to testing whether aid work, is what I've set out here. It's a multidisciplinary approach. I believe that there is a huge role for qualitative research just as much as there's a huge role for quantitative research. I believe that qualitative evidence is essential to understand context. It's essential to identifying what the issues are, identifying what the problems are, and also to proposing possible ways to address these problems. But I don't believe the qualitative evidence can be used to definitively say that this is what works. I believe that quantitative approaches are needed for that. Some of the common criticisms, and Angus Deaton would agree with these criticisms, and would state these criticisms, and I would agree with them, is that it only detects mean treatment effects, average effects. You don't know what happens to all members of the community. You can just see on average what happens. Too much focus on whether something works and not why it works. And also questions over generalizability and external validity. So, okay, it works in this particular context, but can you generalize that? And I believe that these criticisms can be overcome through the approach that I mentioned earlier, through collaborative approaches with a multidisciplinary research team, working with NGOs on the ground and working with government ministries. And these partnerships will allow us to overcome these drawbacks of the randomised controlled trial approach. Talk a little bit about our impact evaluation unit, TIME, in Trinity. So TIME was launched earlier this year. I believe a number of people in the audience were at our launch. And really what our vision is in TIME is to provide strong evidence of what works so that better investments that have real impact on the development process can be made. And what we do is we bring together researchers from different disciplines, we bring together development practitioners, NGOs, policymakers, and together in a collective effort we want to estimate and understand the impact of development investments. So one of our core aims is not only to just look at impact, but to also understand the mechanisms, why behaviour changes, why people change their behaviour when you have a certain programme or a certain aid investment. And in doing that, we really want to be very precise about the identification. We want to make sure that there is a causal relationship here. Because if we're going to try and scale programs up, if we're going to try and make policy recommendations based on the evidence that we're finding through this, we want to make sure that it's not just, it's not some other confounding factor that is driving this result.
So this sounds not like Carol's example, which sounds much more, this is collaborative and careful work that she's recommending to, make these trials relevant to the context and build on the whole range of knowledge that we have. So my argument is really with the problem that trial data, it's not with the data itself or the findings, but it's with the temptation to treat evidence as definitive when it isn't, to treat impact evaluations as just telling us about a technical intervention, that we can just replicate that technical intervention, when there are many more complex issues about getting that intervention to be taken up and whether it's going to work in context. And so the point here about evidence is that it's about evidence use. So evidence and synthesis, they can't replace decision-making responsibility, right? Which still requires intellectual work. Nancy Cartwright and James Hardy have written about this in their book about evidence-based practice, that these trials and systematic reviews, they won't take the responsibility away for weighing all the evidence up and making a good decision, and these activities still require political will.
Randomised controlled trials and such things. And therefore, in a sense, while I'm hugely sympathetic to what Carol is talking about, I also, perhaps better than some of you, know where the bodies are buried. And the bodies are buried in the word cause. Now, statistical inference, as most of you have met it, and in randomised controlled trials and so forth, is really good at one thing. It's really good at saying what if something does not work. That's what it's good at. Those of you who have struggled with the concept of null hypothesis and statistical significance, what statistics is really, really good at is saying what doesn't work. Statistics is really bad at saying what causes things.
That you need to combine it with a qualitative approach. The point I was making was that in terms of really when we get as close as possible to causality, maybe not exact causality, then we need more qualitative research to really understand why we see what we see.
My question is just, if those randomized control trials have all these problems that you've mentioned, why not try and design a very qualitative study that could give us an approximation of, again, only an approximation, but also an approximation of causality in the same way that maybe the trial can, and more importantly, overcome some of the issues with the randomized control trials. So instead of just knowing that the pen drops, we might even be able to find out why John's standing in a lecture theatre and dropping pens, or why somebody's trying to privatize gravity. You know, like there's other kind of ways that we might be able to find out through a realist evaluation or a critical ethnography or something.
There are multiple causes of all the different elements there. So causes are multiple, and I think it's more useful to think about which parts are actionable. So it's useful to think that dropping is, because we can intervene with dropping. It's harder to intervene with gravity. How do you measure wellness? What do you think are the outcomes of a free and independent media that you think are important? How do you know whether you've successfully prevented a conflict or done enough disaster preparedness work?
I asked about the value added of randomized control trials and whether that can be compensated by qualitative studies instead. And I think for me the interesting thing that we should discuss more is whether the determinant impact in its own is value added, or whether the processes that go behind it and the possibly unintended consequences of many of these programs as well could tell us more about improving living conditions for people all over the world. So maybe measuring impact through a very quantitative way gives us information, but maybe not the information that could really help us improve.
So-called development success story. It's rolled out sanitation to about 60 countries around the world. It's been mainstreamed in many African countries in terms of the sanitation. It's made sanitation sexy. It's made that people talk about shit, basically, and the fact that we've got to stop open defecation. But when you actually do these systematic RCTs on it, it's very difficult to capture the health benefits of this intervention. That's because it's so much stuff going on. I mean, it's not just, you can't really come up with a narrow impact pathway. But there are lots of other benefits. Dignity of women, the fact that there's collective action, the fact that the profile of sanitation has been raised, highlighting the problems of open defecation, etc. A lot of these issues, impacts on livelihoods, none of that can actually have been captured in a lot of these very, very narrow studies. And so this narrow SR-RCT lens provided limited insight into contextual factors that can affect achievement of impact. And it's also striking, what is striking is the lack of attention to questions of agency, contextual factors, So this suggests the need to focus on diverse impact pathways to provide for greater benefits. So for example, one could, let's say in the WASH sector, say, okay, maybe we need to support local innovation, we need to look at different forms of governance, not just local, but polycentric forms of governance. One needs to enlist local people's agency in the spread of these interventions. And also, when you really focus very narrowly on a certain outcome, for example, WASH, and then does it lead to reduction in diarrhea, you could also not focus on some other bads, for example, what's happening in terms of gender equality. You know, if it's good for sustainability, is that necessarily going to enhance gender equality, or could there be some knock-on effects? Could you lead to some stereotyping of roles, or indeed some environmental harms? So to sum that first point up, that narrow focus can mask a focus on both wider benefits and harms. And when you draw attention of this to policymakers and others, we often said, okay, but it's too complex. It's very difficult to capture all that, so we need something simple. We can't really capture a lot of these complexities. But without that, I think you're losing sight of what really matters. But as a qualitative researcher, primarily, I am always struck by the fact that I'm forced to produce numbers to make my research seem credible to policymakers and to economists who still have who still call the shots in our field. About the way in which development is now being increasingly mixed with business drives, with the war on terror. I was at a meeting last year in Holland where somebody from the development ministry was saying, we're into people, profit and planet. And I was thinking, okay, what about plunder, you know? I mean, are we looking at those issues too? Because when you combine trade and aid, all sorts of things can happen. And I'm in Brighton in the UK, and I see that we're being really driven for value for money, for results, etc. So I just want to end, and when we are compelled all the time to come up with results, to change the world in the life of a research project, you know, my research project is 3 years. Am I really going to change the world in the life of these 3 years?
On evaluations and why they may not be very, very useful at times. And certainly when I talk about evaluations, I get very frustrated when people say I've seen the evaluation and they're talking about the report and they're not talking about the process of the evaluation and having engaged in an evaluation process. And very often the process is as important as the report. And if the process is a good one, very often people will engage with the findings. I think that's really, really important. If we look, certainly in the public service in Ireland, if we look at what is happening in terms of evaluation, the push for evaluation has come from outside, in the same way as in a development context it has often been donor-driven. In Ireland it very much came with our entry into the European Union and with funding from Europe coming to Ireland, pushed forward an evaluation agenda. And it's still not particularly well developed in Ireland, I would say. On the development side, I think it was very much being members of OECD DAC, again pushed forward that idea of ensuring that there is a strong evaluation function within our development programs. But I would say generally in the public sector in Ireland, evaluation is there, but it's not necessarily particularly well developed.
To me, one of the very interesting things is the question of why we hide failure and what we can learn from failure.
From the interviews in Johannesburg and Pretoria was the different conceptions of what the BRICS are. What does this mean for global governance and development? For the Russians, I was told, it's an anti-Western alliance. It's about countering the power of the West. For the Chinese and the Indians, it's additive. It's about reforming structures of global governance so that they are more favourable to the emergence, rise and power projection of India and China and maybe other emerging or developing economies or societies. So this is something malleable, it's not something open to interpretation. Specifically regarding the BRICS, actors from these states are in Africa not because of some notional love of Africa or Africans, but for reasons based on capitalist logics. They're interested in developing their own economies, expanding markets for their own corporations, and putting political and governance structures in place which are facilitative of that. So in a sense, they operate largely, not exclusively, in the same way as other world powers have historically. So there's this kind of old wine in new bottles to some degree. BRICS are cooperating in order to access African markets. Okay, so again, is this a different form of development or reflective of this kind of extractive political economy which has characterized the region's relations with the global political economy? Maybe not very fashionable, but if we look back 100 more years ago, someone had a theory about this, Karl Kautsky. He talked about ultra-imperialism. What was ultra-imperialism? He said this is a phase of development where major world powers and different forms of capital coalesce their power together, and rather than fighting in inter-imperialist wars like Germany and Britain and so on, that they coalesce and project their power collectively, and it's that much stronger for doing that. The biggest port in Durban is currently being redeveloped or refitted so that it can accommodate ships which have 15,000 containers on them, up to 15,000. Think of the flow of goods coming from China in these ships and the kind of economic pressure and displacement pressure that puts on local manufacturers.
So I'm trying to speak to this conference theme of transformative change and the role of evidence-based research and impact, even though this is a very general and quite conceptual historical kind of paper. The paper overview will cover these 5 kind of dots which I'm going to try and join up. The first is this idea of kairos, a right time, a correct time for human rights and development to come together. And this was a point then that was reached at the end of the Cold War when things kind of seemed to be working in favor of a convergence of development and human rights. And I'm going to talk then about how human rights entered into development in a very specific historical conjuncture after apartheid, but also after genocide. So same time that South Africa ends apartheid, Rwanda experiences genocide. Then I want to talk about how development, like stuff, gets into human rights through the general interest in evidence, and how social science methods entered human rights then in order to, as they say, close the escape hatch for human rights implementation. I then want to look at some new and very disturbing research about the divergence of the current global goals, the new Sustainable Development Goals, away from human rights. So where did they go in the Sustainable Development Goals process? And then, if I have time, then I want to conclude by reflecting on a very influential piece of scholarship in the theory and practice of human rights by the Ugandan scholar Mamdani about the transformative demand and what human rights and development really are about. They're really about justice, and a very particular kind of justice, moving away from victims' justice towards what Mamdani calls survivors' justice.
The reason it is successful is because there was absolute total local buy-in, and we put a huge amount of effort into making sure that it was the local people who owned it. What I like about VMM and Mission Kara, that they don't think in 3-year terms, they think in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And that is the key.
The 50% did not make any progress on pre-primary education. So you have many kids like me who have never experienced pre-primary education before.
The reality is the first time we've had a water study group meeting with DSA, and we would very much like to go ahead, go on with that, have water and environmental issues brought together.
LIFE project is a large-scale interdisciplinary project. It's made up of a group of scientists, of engineers, of social scientists, all working together collaboratively to try and solve some of the issues around safe water provision in sub-Saharan Africa. It was funded through the PSC programme, the Irish Aid Higher Education Authority's programme for strategic cooperation, and it ran from 2009 and literally just finished this year. No discipline is going to solve the problem. We need to work together in a very collaborative way to solve the bigger issues around water provision, because there's issues around gender, there's issues around infrastructure, there's issues around climate change, issues around governance. It's multifaceted, so it's going to take us all to work together to come up with solutions that work and that are sustainable for the future.
When I talk about development, I always include both environment and the social side of things. For me, these are always inherently interconnected. So ever since we started talking about sustainable development in the 1980s, environmental degradation has become extreme or intensified. Under capitalism, there are ways in which, and this has happened in the past, in which you can rein in inequality and still live under a capitalist system. I mean, in Western Europe is a great example, right? After the World War, it was sort of, we need to rein in capitalist development into a social security system in order to make sure that, of course, there's rough edges there, but we need to sort of make sure that they aren't as rough as they could be. Intensified, right, are actually promoted and seen as sort of side effects of other things that are more valuable. And this is also part of the idea of biopolitics, of course, or an intensified biopolitics, where you see literally that some forms of life are allowed to thrive in this. Apparently the 1% is allowed to thrive because, they're just more inventive than all the rest of us. They're smarter. So, we should just, pull up ourselves in our bootstraps and do better. And otherwise, we are to blame. We're apparently not resilient enough. We're not creative enough.
I was very impressed with the research in action working group that met this afternoon, and what they really were having in this discussion was a very open discussion about the challenges when we're trying to bring all of these different groups together, and it is very challenging and there are barriers, and DSAI are breaking down those barriers by opening up this discussion. So it was very heartened to see to be present at that discussion this afternoon.
That's quite interesting and departure for us as locals, and we kind of recognise that academia and academic institutes do play a really important role in development, and they can be really beneficial to NGOs. So we have an enormous amount of information held within different organisations and within the sector at large, and the whole basis of DOCA's being set up was to promote that learning between organisations and even within organisations for some of the bigger ones as well across these silos. So that's so much more relevant today than it ever was, because programmes are getting larger, there's more evaluation, baselines, research being done. So I think as our members, they're very much starting to engage more and more with research. And this is back to the reason I outlined at the start, is that harder questions are being asked of NGOs. We've been asked, prove you've got value for money, prove you're doing the right thing, what are your outcomes, what are you achieving, how are you influencing, the meso and the macro level in the countries that you're working in. And to do that, they need to engage with researchers.
At the outset is, and when we talk about knowledge management, we're talking about two sort of different things, or a spectrum of things. We're talking about the evidence base, which is largely data-driven, either qualitative or quantitative. We're also talking about practice, how people do and how organisations do things. And that's mostly tacit. And the literature tells us that about 80 or 90% of the knowledge that exists in organisations is tacit. It's never going to get written down or codified in any shape or form. That's something we have to keep in mind. A lot of the stuff as well around knowledge management organisation literature that we see from an academic perspective is aimed at the corporate sector. And business rationales about organisational efficiency, profit, all of that stuff sort of characterise the underlying motivations for much of what happens in knowledge management and the recommendations. And certainly the development sector can benefit from that because NGOs need to continue to improve their organisational efficiencies as well. good participatory action research and do it in a way that's very mindful and very sensitive to the context in which they're doing it. There are other academics who are at another end of the spectrum who are doing a very different type of research, which is driven by the metrics we're all measured by, which is our ISI publications and so on. And it is, Sean, you're absolutely right. I think that we have obligations as academics to ensure that we're that we're behaving ethically and sensitively in every context. But also, I think choosing who, the choices you make as research partners are vitally important as well in terms of not only their domain expertise but also their methodological approaches.
The goal is in the process of really strengthening and opening a discussion and growing a sense of the importance of research and evidence in improving our practice. So we've just developed, and we're talking about a research and learning strategy for the organization. And I'll just say that we have identified as our drivers, why do we want a research and learning strategy? To strengthen our impact, i.e. to scale up whatever is working, to know what works and to scale it up appropriately, to improve how we do things, to understand what's not going well and how to get it and make it better. To anticipate things, we want to identify through research conditions, facilitators, barriers that are helping us understand what might be coming next. Right? More and more and more we're in the humanitarian space, and if we knew only better from gathering evidence and understanding conditions, we could anticipate what's around the corner for the communities we're trying to.
Even Irish NGOs and their work can be quite a task in itself. I mean, Goal has his website, Christian Aid, Troker, Concern, we all have our different knowledge repositories. But I mean, it's quite a task for someone to go in and try and search them, individually.
And frankly, the only research I've seen to be particularly useful is research when the participants of whatever you're doing actually undertakes the research themselves. It's a lot cheaper, it's a lot more meaningful. It means that those people undertaking research tend to look at it from their perspective, from what they want to actually get out of whatever they're doing. And I have seen some fantastic results coming out of that. Some of this so-called empowerment, this word I don't like, but nevertheless, particularly for women, I've seen huge changes. And I would just suggest that we get rid of 90% of the consultants, 90% of the people who run around Africa doing these things, and actually support people doing the research themselves.